Hi, welcome back to Christine's Home Affairs. I'm in the mood for some mindless batch sewing today, so I'm going to take you along and show you how I go about processing fabric and trying to decide what it is I'm actually going to do. I have a kind of an idea in mind, but as far as dimensions, I have no idea whatsoever. I've got a couple of rolls of denim fabric, so I've just cut off some of that. I'm going to use that as my main fabric for these bags that I'm doing. And I'll also be using this sample of swatches. So I'm going to see how many bags I can get out of this sample. The sizing will be determined by the amount of good fabric that I can get out of these once the paper has been removed. I'm also going to do this as a time trial. I'm working on a new product. I don't know how long it takes me to do these. I'm just going to go ahead and process all the fabric that I need to put these together, my zips and tabs and all of those sorts of things. I'll have my production line happening. We'll put the timer on and we'll see how long it takes me to make however many bags I can get. And at the end of that, we'll work out together how much I'm going to charge for these bags. Before I can start anything, I have to remove the paper from the back of these samples. With my hot iron, I'm just going to start heating this section here, starting at the back of the last sample. When that's hot enough, the glue will release the fabric from the fibres. Whilst the fabric's still warm, you do have a sticky residue on the back that ends up being okay by the time it cools down and you sew it together. This part's a little bit tedious. Most of the papers tend to come off fairly easily. Anything that's a little bit more difficult to come off, I'll just hit it with the iron to help release some of that glue. Anything that doesn't want to go, I'll just leave that and set it aside. I'll trim everything back afterward. At this point here, I've taken off as much of the paper as I can, and I'm still keeping in mind that I don't want to have to spend too much time going through this process. I'm just taking my ruler and trimming off as much excess as I can without actually wasting any fabric. Now I've got my solid fabric and my printed fabric. I'm just going to have a look and see which way I want to lay them out, have a good think about it, see how I'm going to get the best out of my fabric. What I've decided to do, I don't have a lot of colours to work with. I've got a lot of printed fabrics to work with, but I don't have much by way of plain. So I think what I need to do is probably cut the solid in half. I'll be able to use a solid print on a couple of the different printed fabrics. So I'm just going to cut each of the solids in half. I'll work out which way it'll sit better on the printed fabric, and then I'm just going to cut them all in half so that I can stitch those onto my printed ones later. Once I've managed to cut that one solid piece in half, I kind of lay it out against a couple of the other printed fabrics, see which ones look best, and I'll have a play around with the patterns just to see which way I'm going to end up putting them all together. I've cut the solid pieces in half, and I'm just going to line these up along one side of the printed pieces of fabric and have them ready to take to the machine to sew up. I'm just going to make a great big pile, take them all to the machine, stitch everything down on that one edge. With my two pieces of fabric here, I've got the larger piece and the one that's half the size. I'm going to sew every pair together, just keep on chain stitching everything through. Once everything's been chain stitched, then I can go and top stitch. Now it's time to top stitch these two fabrics, and it really doesn't matter at this point which side you actually top stitch to. Because I usually use one colour thread for all of the bags, I'll usually top stitch toward the printed side or the fabric that's got the most print on it, and I'll try and carry that through with the rest of the bags as well. So I'll pick one side to top stitch, just do the same for the rest of it. Here I'm measuring a few of the pieces of fabric just to get an idea of what I'm going to be doing in the next few steps. I measure the narrow side of the fabric. I'll average out the width of the narrowest section of fabric here. I'll slice everything straight down the center there, and I plan to have a piece of denim in between these two pieces once I cut them apart. I'll cut these straight down the center, and once I've done those, I can start getting my denim pieces ready. This is the part where I find out what size I'm actually going to make my bag. The two printed pieces that I've already stitched together, I'll measure a few pieces of these. I'll just get a width and the length of those. It'll give me an idea of how big I need to cut my denim contrast fabrics. So I've measured the length of the two pieces put together and the approximate width. I usually do a few of them just to get a rough measurement, and then I can actually go and cut up those blue denim pieces a little bit bigger. When we've attached all the fabrics later, that's when we can square everything up for a perfect fit later. With the denim squares cut out, I'll take the two sections of printed fabric and line them up nice and evenly along the long edges on each side of the denim, and then I'll set them aside, and I'll repeat that for all of the other pieces. I like to just build up the piles. It's a lot quicker to go and do this with every single piece, building up the piles, setting them aside, and then when I take them to the machine, everything's already in place and I can just stitch them all down those long edges. The whole process like this goes very quick. This part's really easy. The two printed pieces that we've already stitched together, we just need to place those on either side of the denim piece of fabric, sew straight down both long edges, and once we've done the entire amount, we'll be able to fold them out and top stitch. When you're top stitching this section here, because I've got the two pieces of fabric already joined to the denim, I don't want to have my top stitching going over to the side where I've already got a seam. So I'm going to push the seam away from the two pieces of printed fabric and put it toward the denim and top stitch all the way down that side. Then I'll flip it around and do exactly the same thing on the other side of the bag. So that way my top stitching is on both sides of the denim, and that reduces a lot of the bulk. Makes the whole bag sit a lot nicer. Labels are next, so I will centre the labels over the top of the denim section. I'll lay it out in a few different places just to see which looks best, and then I'll put them all on in exactly the same position. If it's too creased, I'll press the lining fabric first. I'm going to put 4 layers of lining fabric together, and then I'll place 2 layers of the out of bag fabric on top of each other as well. This way I get to use up lots of different lining fabrics. I'll really just reach out and grab anything that I think might work for the particular bags that I've got. And having the 2 layers of the main bag fabric laid out at the same time as I have the 4 layers of the lining fabric laid out, then I can cut out the 2 bags at the same time, and it's just such a nice quick process. I don't have to go and measure every single piece of fabric to match every single bag. What I do now is cut some zipper tape that is just slightly larger than the width of the bag. I'll run a strip of double-sided tape over the top edge, place my zipper tape faced down on top of the fabric, and then I'll rip the top section off, turn it around to the other side, and do the same at the other end of the bag. The double-sided tape helps keep everything in place really well. And then pop your lining over the top. You've got your zipper tape sandwiched in between your main fabric and your lining piece, and then everything's nice and neat, ready to go to the machine. You can of course go and use pins or clips. I find that pins in particular distort the fabric, and clips are cumbersome and add a bit of weight to everything, and it just all takes time. With the double-sided tape holding the zippers down, you can see here how quick it is just to zip through and stitch everything in place. Even though the double-sided tape is an added expense, it's only a small expense, and certainly worth the effort putting it in, because it just makes the whole insertion of the zip process go really, really quick. I really enjoy this part of sewing. Once the zips are in on both sides of the bag, turn everything the right way around and we can prepare this for top stitching. So I'm just going to flatten everything out, tidy it all up nicely, and then I can top stitch the zip down on both ends. With both lining and main pieces of fabric pulled away from the zipper teeth, I use the tips of my fingers to hold on to the zipper teeth, and I'll just put my hand inside the tube there so that it helps pull both layers of fabric away from the teeth, and I don't have any pleats or tucks on the wrong side. Do that on both sides, and then I'll just grab the next piece of fabric and do exactly the same thing. I really enjoy doing this batch sewing. And then I'll work on my tabs. I like to do this part at the machine rather than just folding all of the edges together and clipping it in place. That all takes time. Drawing the line down the centre of the fabric helps me to bring the raw edges into the fabric, and then I'll just finger press that, fold it in half again, and I'll do all of that as I'm sewing. That helps me save a little bit of extra time as well. When you've got so many bags to do, this can actually save quite a bit of time. And my favourite part is once I've finished sewing one side, I can just turn it around and zip along to do the entire full length of the other side. All we need to do now is take all of these little denim strips and cut them up into about 2.5-inch strips. These will be used for our tabs on the side of the bag later on. Put your arm right in, grab the other end of the lining, and you want to separate the main fabric and the lining piece. So just pull everything out so that it's all inside out. Then we have two separate sections of the bag. So we want our lining and our main fabric all separated. We need to line up the bag now so that we can actually create a false seam in the lining. And what we'll do is fold the main fabric and the lining fabric away from each other. Where you've got the seams in the fabric on the outside of the bag, line up those seams at the top and the bottom, and then just fold out the lining fabric until you've got a nice fold at the right hand side there. Put a pin in place just so that it doesn't shift whilst you take it to the machine. When creating that false seam, you'll do a back stitch at the beginning, then come down a couple of inches and do another back stitch, stop sewing, leave a gap of about 3 inches or so, and repeat for the other side. I find this technique much quicker than having to make sure I've got the beginning and the ending of the fabric all lined up properly. It's just so much quicker to stitch the folded edge of the fabric down. You know that everything's lined up. Do a back stitch at the beginning and the end, leave that opening of a few inches, and then do exactly the same thing on the other side. We've finished stitching right along the lining edge of the fabric and created that false seam. Once all of those false seams are done, just take your scissors, a seam ripper, or even your rotary cutter and cut open that little section at the bottom of your false seam. I'll just slice that open about 1 inch on either side of the stitching line there. At this point here, we want to put our little tabs in for this side of the bag. We also want to lay the fabric out in the correct order so that we can go and stitch everything closed. Open out the main section of your bag. You've got your seams there just on the outside edge, which will form the left and right part of your bag, and that centres it nicely over the top of the zip as well. Grab the zipper tabs, make sure your tabs are on the outside fabric of the bag rather than on the lining, otherwise all those tabs that you put in are going to be on the inside of your bag. Clip that in place. You'll do that on both ends, and then once you've clipped your tabs in place and just made sure the outer fabric is all lined up nicely, take the lining and you can centre that over your zip as well. And you'll have that false seam that we have underneath just centered over the zipper area. And then just flatten everything out and make sure it's nice and neat. I've decided to use strapping instead of the tabs that I made earlier. I found that the denim tabs were just a little bit too bulky, so the strapping's much easier to work with. With everything centered nicely, you can see that I've got the layers of fabric separated. I've got just a clip on the outside edge where the zipper tape is, and we'll take this to the machine now and stitch each of the layers individually, and once those individual layers are done, then we can close up this section where the zip is. So on every section on both ends of the bag, I'll do a back stitch at the beginning, and then I'll do a back stitch just as I come up to the edge of the zipper tape, and then I'll just fold the top layer of fabric out of the way and repeat for the other side. And sometimes it's easier to turn your fabric around so that you can start on the outside edge of your fabric as well. Just stitch all the way up to the zipper tape, but not through the tape at this stage. Once you've done that, you can flip it over and then we can sew the lining, and we'll do the lining in exactly the same way. Sew up to the zipper tape. You may not get as far. And once you've done that side, we'll go and flip it around and do the other side as well. Make sure all of the layers are sitting together nice and flat, and just that section where the zipper is, you'll stitch that closed. So in that middle part, I'll start just on the outside edge of where the zipper tape is, backstitch, then I'll backstitch a couple of times over the area where the zipper teeth are, and then I'll come just beyond the tape and then I'll backstitch again. That secures all of the layers of all of the fabric together, and it will actually close up the end of the zip as well. And you've still got the flaps separated so that we can do the boxing later. I've got this tiny little plastic template, and I'm just marking 1.5 inch squares on the edges of my bags. So I'm lining up the 1.5 inch on the stitching line of the seam and also against the folded edge of the fabric. So go and mark that out on all of your bags at 1.5 inches. And all you need to do is lay all the sides flat together. We're going to cut all of this out in one go. We don't have much more to go, but this is probably the most time-consuming section of the whole bag process now. Cut out all of the squares that we've marked now. Often, rather than boxing my corners, I'll just take everything to the machine. I'll use the markings on my machine as my guide so that I can just pinch the edges together. But I do find when I'm batch sewing, I actually kind of like cutting out all of my corners. So I'm just going to go and cut out all the corners on these bags here. It has everything sitting nicely, and it'll mean that I can actually see my side seams when I'm matching everything up as well. So it does help make everything sit better. I've cut out all the corners on all of the bags, and what we need to do here is just fold the edges together to prepare it to sew. So I line up the seams along the side and along the bottom. I'll make sure my seams are pointing in opposite directions. I'll have the top seam, for example, going to my left, and the bottom seam, or the one closest to me, going to my right. And that way they butt together really nicely and you'll get a nice finish on the outside. So just go and pinch all of the edges together on each of your corners of your main, and then do exactly the same thing for your lining pieces as well. This is the part when you're making so many bags. It can be quite a bit time consuming. Straight under your machine, backstitch at the beginning and the end. For the outside of the bags, I like to triple stitch just to give it some extra stability. On the lining, I usually just backstitch over any seam intersections and close it up. You'll notice that I've clipped the first bag, but I haven't gone and done that with any of the other bags. I find it's much quicker to do it at the machine, and I'll just pinch the edges together and then stitch them all closed whilst I'm at the machine. It just saves that extra 10 or 15 minutes of preparation time when you sit at the machine and do it as you go. Now that the entire pile of bags is finished, what we need to do now is turn everything the right way around, poke out all of the corners, and hopefully you've also remembered to keep your zips open whilst you've been sewing. Otherwise you're going to have a real job trying to get into these bags. I have a tendency to forget to open my zips all the time. It does pay to check your first bag just to make sure that you have actually remembered to open your zips. So just poke out all your corners and tidy everything up. If you're happy with that, it'll be ready to go and stitch closed. To close up the opening, all you need to do is pull the edges out taut. It'll make the folds of the fabric go underneath where they're supposed to be, and then all I need to do is top stitch. I'll do a back stitch at the beginning and at the end, and then stitch that opening closed, and then the job's completely finished. I won't make you sit around and watch me close up all the bags. It's a rainy Sunday morning in town, and I have bought all my bags to the shop. Well, I actually bought them to the shop yesterday, and I ended up making 12 of them. So let's see how the time and cost factor has worked out. By the time I've put the labels and tags on, it's taken me 7.5 hours from the very beginning to the end and having it ready for sale. So 7.5 hours. I charge $45 an hour for everything that I do, but I do play around with that a little bit. Now, in my $45 an hour labour rate, I include things like thread, power, taxes. What else do I include, Chris? I can't remember. Thread, power, story of my life. Thread, power, taxes, all those little bits and pieces, and machine maintenance as well. So at 7.5 hours at $45 an hour works out to be about $337 in total cost for me to make these bags. Then there's the material. The fabric I didn't pay for, you know that they're all sample swatch fabrics, but I've got the cost of material for the zips. I ended up using the webbing instead of fabric for my tabs on the end. And then there are things like my shop labels, my Australian made label, and my little fabric labels. All of that came up to another $12. I've made 12 bags, so that's just $1 each extra. So by the time I've factored in labour and all the bits and pieces that I've actually paid for, these bags work out to be $29 each to make. Now, before I started this project, I did have in my mind that I wanted to have a $30 to $35 price tag on these. So given that these are $29 to make, I worked that out really well. I've already priced these in the shop at $35 each. I put them all just on the side yesterday and sold one within an hour of being in the shop. So it tells me that my price guide is fairly correct. I've got 12 really cute little zippered bags, and they're all a little bit individual. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I shall catch you next time. Bye for now.